It was when its name had been changed, and which is now the actual fact called whatever that name is. I'm not going to try that one. Here is another Ephraim the Syrian. I think I scared everybody just with that slide. Just trying to find something that's easy to read, but it's not too many names. Concerning Nimrod, Moses said, here's what this church father said. His name was Ephraim the Syrian. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, because according to the will of the Lord, it was he who fought with each of these nations and chased them out from there, so that they would go out and settle in the regions that had been apart from them. Therefore it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, one used to bless a chief or ruler by saying, may you be like Nimrod, a mighty hunter who was victorious in the battles of the Lord. So here's a perspective that maybe he wasn't so bad a guy. Then we read about what Prudentius writes. A Nimrod who goes around the world makes rough with deep ravines and wooden crags, and strives to waylay some by fraud and secret wiles, to vanquish others by his giant arms and spread his deadly triumphs far and wide. What's kind of the overall picture you're getting of this guy Nimrod so far?
The bully.
Bully? Dictator? Dalton, are you feeling brave enough to try to read one of these? Come on up. Now, if I remember, I think I quoted here, there's Philo that I've quoted from, and then there is Josephus. I'm trying to remember which one is this. This is Philo. All right. And okay, Philo was, just so you know who he is, he was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria in the Roman province of Egypt during the time of Christ. So he would have been a contemporary with Christ. He says Nimrod's a direct son of Cush, and you're going to see what he's got to say about that. Let me go back to the right view here. Okay, you got it.
Why was Cush the father of Nimrod, who began to be a giant and a hunter before the Lord? On which account they said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis 10:8. The father in this case, having a nature truly dissolute, does not at all keep fast the spiritual bond of the soul, nor of nature, nor of consistency of manners, but rather, like a giant born of the earth, prefers earthly to heavenly things, and thus appears to verify the ancient fable of the giants and titans. For in truth, he who is an emulator of earthly and corruptible things is always engaged in a conflict with heavenly and admirable natures, raising up earth as a bulwark against heaven, and those things which are below are adverse to those which are above.
Was that sound like a guy that seeks after God or fights God? I just want to make sure we're going to thank you, Dalton. Here's part 2 of what I used from Philo. So you see, raised up the Tower of Babel, idol worship, so what you were saying, Todd, about that he kind of started worship of other gods. Here is what Philo continues to say. On which account there is much propriety in the expression, he was a giant against God, which thus declares the opposition of such beings to the deity. For a wicked man is nothing else than an enemy, contending against God. On which account it has become a proverb that everyone who sins greatly ought to be referred to him as the original and chief of sinners, being spoken of as a second Nimrod. You don't want anybody to call you a second Nimrod. That's pretty bad. Therefore, his very name is an indication of his character, for it is interpreted Ethiopian, and his art is that of hunting, both of which things are detestable, an Ethiopian, because unmitigated wickedness has no participation in life, but imitates night and darkness. And the practice of the huntsman is as much as possible at variance with rational nature. For he who lives among the wild beasts wishes to live the life of a beast, and to be equal to the brutes and the vices of wickedness. That was Philo. Now, has everybody heard of Josephus? Josephus had something to say about this guy Nimrod. You're more welcome to try. Look for an easy slide and then come on up. Come on up. So these are sections here. I have it right here.
Now I have for witnesses to what I have said all those who have written iniquities, both among the Greeks and the barbarians. For even Mantheo, who wrote the Egyptian history, and Barosus, who collected the Chaldean monuments, and Mocus and Hestius, and besides those, Hieronymus the Egyptian, and those who composed the Phoenician history, agree to what I here say. Hesiod also, and Hectius, Halicius, Acuslius, and besides these, Ephorius and Nicolaus related the ancient lived 1,000 years, but as to these matters let everyone look up upon them as he thinks fit.
Would you give both Katie and Dalton a hand for being brave enough to try to read these? Now let me tell you what Josephus just said. Josephus just cited his sources. What he's about to tell you, he has just gone through the historians of their day, the ones that were held in high regard, and he's saying, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. We're all saying, I'm getting all my information from them, and they're all saying the same thing. So, he has now cited his sources. His grammar teacher, his language teacher would be very happy with him. So he's not plagiarizing, he's footnoting. And here is what he says about this matter. Now the sons of Noah were three, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, one born 100 years before the deluge of the flood. These first of all descended from the mountains into the plains and fixed their habitations there. Well, that makes sense. Came off of Mount Ararat, kind of settled in the plain of Shinar, which is the Babylonian area, and persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the floods, and so were very loath to come down to the higher place to venture to follow their example. And you can see I'm taking this from the Annals of Josephus. Now the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. When you see that, think Babylon. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, spread, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth, enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. But they were so ill instructed that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities and were made sensible by experience of what sin they had been guilty. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured happiness. You should be reading this and saying, wow, this sounds like today. And then should be reflecting upon Solomon's words that I repeat often, there is no new thing under the sun. Next section here. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into constant dependence on his power. We have any example of a government trying to make its people more dependent upon itself?
Oh, yeah.
He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high sooner than anyone could expect. So they esteemed it to be cowardice to submit to God. And so I guess that's an example of following the crowd isn't always the right thing to do, huh? Let's read the next section. When God saw that they acted so madly that he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not growing wiser by the destruction of their former sinners. Isn't that sad? They could talk to their own grandfather or great-grandfather about what happened, or their father. Didn't matter. But he caused a tumult. So I guess this would be an example of the prodigal son, wouldn't it? But he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that, through the multitudes of those languages, that they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language, which they readily understood before, for the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. Our next section here. The Sibyl also makes mention of this tower and of the confusion of the language when she says thus, quote, when all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, as if they would thereby ascend up to heaven. But the gods sent storms of wind and overthrew the tower, and gave everyone his peculiar language, and for this reason it was that the city was called Babylon. So he's quoting from another source. They obviously have a little bit different perspective, but kind of the same events. But as to the plain of Shinar and the country of Babylonia, Hestius mentions it when he says thus, such of the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter and Ilias and came to the Shinar of Babylonia. So there you see the examples of worship of other gods. All right. So what was Nimrod's end? How did it all end for this first dictator? This is where I'm going to read. Give me 1 second. I'll tell you what I'm going to read from. Change my view. Notes. So we read last night, we read a portion from Jonshur's Concise History of the Georgians. And so he was a Georgian prince and a historian, this gentleman whose name is, I think, Jonshur. And I'm going to read to you what he wrote about Nimrod. So let us recall the fact that the Armenians, Georgians, Albanians, other names I'll just go through and just... One father named Torgama. Remember we looked at Torgama? One of the sons of, sons or grandsons of Japheth, I forget which. But anyhow, it was in that line that we looked at. And we saw that this group had kind of moved around the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains and got into some parts of Russia and some parts of Eastern Europe. So he's talking about here. Father named Torgama, son of Cherus, son of Gomer, son of Japheth, son of Noah. He was a brave, gigantic man. At the time of the destruction of the Tower of Babel and the division of tongues and the dispersion of mankind throughout the world, Torgama came and settled between these mountains. He had many women, sons and daughters. Of his sons and daughters were born, and he lived 600 years. That's why I brought it up, because there was an example somebody did live a long time after the flood. But the country did not suffice for the multitude of his folk. Therefore they spread out and enlarged their boundaries from the Pontic Sea to the Sea of Heret, and Caspian by the mountains of the Caucasus. Next section. They selected 8 of the bravest and most renowned of his sons. First was Hayek, and then they list all of them. But Hayek was the strongest and bravest. There was none like him on the earth, not before the flood. Plan among them. Half he gave to Hayek, half the seven sons according to their merit. It says here, Hayek inherited half of the patrimony with the stated borders. He was prince of the seven brothers and stood in service to the giant Nimrod, who first ruled the entire world as king. Now, after a few years had passed, Hayek assembled his brothers, and he said to them, "Hear me, my brothers, behold, God has given us might and many people. Now, for the mercy upon us, let us not serve a foreigner, but rather the true God." All consented. Rebelling, they did not provide the tax and brought over to their side the surrounding peoples. Wonder what would happen if we didn't pay our taxes. Do you think somebody would notice? Guess what happened in that day? Somebody noticed. When Nimrod heard about this, he was angered, assembled a multitude of many giants, and rabble set out against them and came to this land. Hayek was with this people by the foot of Mount Mesas. Nimrod dispatched 60 giants with great multitude. The two sides clashed with each other with a fearsome, intense crash like the sound of thunderclouds. There was countless, incalculable numbers slain on both sides. Hayek stood at the rear of his people, encouraging steadfastness like lightning. He himself raided around and felled the last of those 60 giants and their troops. He and the seven brothers remained safe by the grace of God, and they glorified their omnipotent Savior. When Nimrod learned about what had happened, he became extremely agitated, and he himself went against Hayek. But Hayek, not having as many soldiers as Nimrod, fortified himself in the rough places of the Masses valleys. Nimrod was heavily armored with iron from head to foot. He ascended the crest of a hill and summoned Hayek to return to his former obedience. But Hayek didn't respond to him. Rather, he said to his brothers, "Cover me from the rear, and I shall descend to Nimrod." He approached him and shot an arrow at Nimrod's breastplate, which went straight through to the other side. Turning about, he expired forthwith, and his entire army fell. And the house of Torgama reposed without a care. Then Hayek ruled his brothers and all the neighboring peoples as king. So that is what happened to Nimrod. Yes.
So, who wrote that account, did you say?
Guy, it's almost like Juan Shear or Jean Shear.
Okay.
Jean Shear.
And,
He was a Georgian historian.
and just to clarify, Hayek would have been was Hayek truly the one that was worshiping God during that time and then rebelled against? Or?
Yeah, apparently he came to God, decided to worship the one true God, and in order to do that, he was going to have to go against Nimrod.
Interesting.
Yeah. So those are some historical accounts of what people have written about Nimrod. Now, we're going to talk about Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. We're going to unpack that even more in just a few moments. Any questions at this point? Did anybody know all this stuff about Nimrod?
He wasn't a good man, but that's all.
Right. Yes.
About, is there any way of knowing what population
I bet somebody's done some research on it, but I haven't come across it. I did not look for that. But yeah, that's what Christian, that's one of the favorite answers in our class when I ask a question like that. How many people were, and then you guys answer a lot. Yeah, they've got some standard answers that I can't dispute. God, Jesus, the Bible, and a lot. They will answer that to almost every question. About 80% of the time it applies, so I can't really argue with them. So, yes, they're very bright. Yes.
Well, one thing I just learned is that, before you name your children after a person in the Bible, you better research it.
That would be a good idea. There's probably a reason why there's not a lot of Jezebels and Nimrods walking around. So that's
Because, and going back to my family tree, we do have, a pretty close relative, I guess it's like a great-great-grandfather, or a great-great-uncle, whose name was Nimrod. You know, I just never even thought of that.
yeah, it's a good Bible name, right? It's his Bible name.
I guess his mother just picked the name out of the Bible and liked it.
Yep. It's true. I did this, I didn't know any other way to do it other than to present it this way, just read what has been written. And I wanted to give you, because I figured most of you were like me, I hadn't really had anybody, I just heard he wasn't a good guy. But I hadn't heard much beyond that. And so I wanted to kind of bring him to life a little bit through these historians' words. And now, isn't it interesting, do you notice the conflict seems very similar to today? It's like the basic issues really haven't changed much at all. One of the things that doesn't seem to change very much is man. Other things change, but man doesn't change very much at all. So, all right. We're going to take a break for about 15 minutes. We're going to get into our next session. And we're going to unpack a little bit more about the Tower of Babel and Nimrod. So, 15 minutes, I guess. We're almost at 9:30, so let's start at 9:45.